Today we're going to compare Ivy League universities to top Canadian universities. In other words, it's a battle between the best universities in Canada and in the United States. So let's compare these universities using different categories to find out which is better. And make sure to watch this video till the end because the questions I'm going to be asking Charlotte is going to get juicier as we get more into the video. So we'll jump right in. Let's talk about some of the stereotypes about these universities. So one of the biggest stereotypes about top Canadian universities is that it's easy to get in, but it's hard to graduate with a high GPA, while the exact opposite is true for Ivy League universities. So Charlotte, what do you think about this stereotype?
I actually agree with this stereotype. I think in Canada, it's a lot easier to apply and get into the top universities, but once you're in there, it's actually quite challenging to graduate. Meanwhile, in the US, due to the competitive nature of going to schools in the US, I think there's a lot more competition to actually get into these top universities.
Okay, I think it's interesting that you say that because I don't personally 100% agree with this stereotype. The reason why I disagree is because for Canadian universities, it really depends on what faculty you're applying to. Sure, the general University of Toronto or UBC and McGill, the general acceptance rate may be quite high because it's a little bit skewed due to different majors having a higher acceptance rate into their program. Especially at University of Toronto, we have 3 different campuses. So the St. George campus is our main University of Toronto campus. So St. George usually has a lower acceptance rate compared to the other 2 campuses that we have. But when we're talking about University of Toronto's acceptance rate as a whole, we take into consideration of the other 2 campuses as well. So that kind of skews that acceptance rate up. And then for my undergrad specifically, we have this report called Rotman by Numbers every year that shows how many people applied and how many people that actually got in. It's kind of like a class profile of every year. And usually this class profile suggests that we have an acceptance rate of around 10%, which is quite comparable to the Ivy Leagues down in the US, where Cornell accepts about 8%, Rotman accepts about 10%. They're still lower by a marginal amount, but I don't think it's that far apart where you can have this stereotype say, hey, you know, top Canadian universities are easy to get in, hard to get out. I actually think that it's hard to get in as well. In conclusion, what I'm trying to say here is that although I generally agree that it's harder to get into Ivy Leagues, but I think there are a number of elite programs in Canada that are equal or better than some of the programs offered by Ivy League universities.
So as you mentioned, there's these elite programs in Canadian universities. So what do you think the difference is in the job market after graduation, since that's what's the most important thing after you graduate from these programs?
So I think there's a big difference between US job market and Canadian job market. That's because the major cities in Canada and in the US are vastly different. Although Toronto gets compared to New York a lot, I don't think that's a fair comparison. I think the salary differences between US and Canada is quite big as well. Not just because of the Canadian dollar to US dollar differences, but the starting salary in general, I think, are higher in the US job market compared to the Canadian job market. And I think that is because like New York and Silicon Valley, they're one of the biggest tech hubs, financial hubs. So the level of opportunities and the people that you can network as well too are a lot higher of quality in the States rather than in Canada. Also, I think the US job market is a lot more favorable if you want to be like a startup founder, for example. I think the entrepreneurship mindset is a lot more prevalent in these US schools compared to Canadian schools. So if you are looking to be a founder, I think the US job market is also very good for those reasons as well.
I agree with you that there are more opportunities in the US than in Canada, mainly because the US has a lot more cities that have more available jobs. There's headquarters in the US. And going back to what you mentioned earlier about network, I think the Ivy League structure in the US really brings a lot of value to their students who are looking to network into those industries and also into those top companies or headquarters that they want to work in. As a lot of people know, there's like the Harvard Club and then there's the Columbia Club, and all these places are unique to the university, and you get to meet alumni and people who are maybe interested in hiring from those universities, which is a really unique resource that I don't think any Canadian university has or tries to build upon.
I think this is a perfect segue to my next topic that I want to talk about with you, which is actually talking about how it would feel for an Ivy League grad to break into a Canadian job market versus top Canadian grads like UofT and McGill to then break into the US market afterwards. And I can start this conversation off because I personally have an experience breaking into the US job market as a top Canadian grad. And I think the main thing that I realized is that the visa situation is a little bit tricky for Canadians, and I think it might be the same for, the US folks trying to break into Canada. And for a Canadian grad, if you're trying to work in New York City, let's say Wall Street or any of the big firms in New York, you're gonna have to compete with Harvard, MIT, Columbia grads. So when it comes down to recruiters really looking at your resume, you have to have an external factor into the reason why they should hire you who, went to great school. Canadian schools are great, but when compared to Harvard grads, you still need that extra edge for you to really stand out in your application process as well as to really secure that position. So that's why I think a lot of top Canadian undergrad students like to do their masters in these Ivy League universities so that they don't always have to compete against these Ivy League universities. If you can't beat them, you become part of them, right? So I think that's why I see a lot of these top Canadian university grads going to the States and doing their master's or PhD to really level up their resume as well.
I definitely think it's easier for a Ivy League or US undergrad to go to one of these top cities, even around the world, not just Canada, because the US schools are just so globally recognized and the Ivy League name is also carried out throughout the world. So I think if you're coming from Harvard or Columbia or Yale, those names really stand out. And when you're looking for funding, even for your business, for example, that name will stand out and it seems more reputable and recognized around the world to get funding and also getting that network that you might need to grow your business. So moving on to the next question and tying into how we just talked about the global reputation that Ivy Leagues have and also the network, what do you think that Canadian universities bring to their undergraduate students that also provide that same network opportunity?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Canadian universities definitely do their best to provide for their students and their alumni network that the university carries. Most notably, last year we had the Rotman 100 celebration, and we had graduates from all around the world who graduated much in advance to come to Rotman again and then celebrate Rotman's 100-year celebration, as well as to meet with the current students and really give them the guidance that they need to really move forward with their career. So I think the network opportunity is definitely there, and I'm sure that Ivy League universities have this, but what I realized from UofT is that we have our own career website. Maybe it's only like a Rotman thing where you can go into that website and look at all the job postings. And usually the companies who post in these websites that are for Rotman grads or UofT grads, they prefer to hire from Rotman or UofT. So you have a better chance of getting that internship or full-time offer if you go through that link. So I think, even for Canadians, we have very strong infrastructure and good pipeline to all these top companies.
Yeah, that sounds great. And at Columbia and in the Ivy Leagues in general, there's often networking events between the Ivy League schools. So we have the Ivy League conferences as well as Ivy League sport where we compete against other schools. And that creates a really good bond between the students in all the different Ivy Leagues. And you create a network that can go beyond just school, but also into your career in the future as well. And speaking of these universities, if you look at the top companies in the world and in the US as well, you can look at the pipeline and you'll see that a lot of these companies are hiring from these Ivy League schools. So you'll see that the valuable network that you'll grow in these universities will help you get those top jobs at these companies.
So let's now move on to the next question, which is arguably the most juiciest question of this entire video, and that is to talk about the ROI of these universities. So this is probably the reason why I think the top Canadian universities are a lot better than Ivy League universities. And I can start this conversation off because there is such a big difference between the tuition cost as well as the cost of living. So for example, let's talk about UofT and UofT's most popular undergrad programs. So right now, when we go onto UofT's website and compare the tuition between each of these programs, Rotman and ComSci right now are the two most expensive programs that UofT offers. But even the most expensive programs programs, they range from 10 to 15K in tuition, and the cost of living can really vary depending on what type of lifestyle you want to live in Toronto. But I would say they're usually 30 to 40K a year to live a decent lifestyle in Toronto. But I think that's nothing compared to some of these expensive Ivy League schools in the States. So for example, the average tuition that these Ivy League universities charge you is around 70,000 US dollars, which is $100,000 in Canadian dollars. And that's only the tuition. So if you were to go to school like Columbia, which is in New York City, the living costs, I don't even know, like how much do you think it'll be per year?
Probably around
60K
Yeah.
USD, 60 to 70K USD,
Yeah.
I would assume,
Yeah.
to live a pretty decent life.
Decent lifestyle,
Yeah, decent
yeah.
lifestyle. So that's another $100,000 in Canadian dollars. So you're expecting to pay around $200,000 a year living and attending school like Columbia. And that's why I think that top Canadian universities are actually better when we adjust it to the ROI perspective. But don't get me wrong, Harvard is probably, the best university. It's the best you can get.
Yeah, well, I think you brought up some great points. I think you're completely right in so many ways that it doesn't make a lot of sense for a Canadian to go to a US school for their undergrad, especially because there's a lot of great opportunity that you can get straight out of Canadian schools after you graduate. However, I do think that US schools are a great option for Canadians who want to do their master's program, because a lot of these US schools have a lot more options, and they provide also the access or gateway into the US after you graduate, especially because after you graduate, you get 1 year of visa, OPT, to help you get accustomed to the US job market and hopefully get a company to sponsor you a visa in the long term.
So my final question to you, Charlotte, is even with this ROI perspective in mind, would you say the Ivy network and the reputation that you get from Ivy League is worth it?
Yeah, I think that actually attending a Ivy League for your master's program is maybe more worth it than doing an undergrad in the US, just because of the ROI perspective. Masters are also a lot shorter in time, and you get that master's degree under your belt and have an opportunity to work in the US afterwards. And I think long-term wise, it's important to have an Ivy League name under your belt because it will be prevalent throughout your life, and it's something that has recognition and reputation from all around the world, and that might carry out longer than just having an undergrad or a master's from a Canadian university.
In conclusion, we think that both top Canadian universities and Ivy League universities are both wonderful options, and I think it really boils down to what you're really looking to get out of your undergrad or your master's experience. So depending on what you're looking for, I think the answer to this question will be very different. So that's it for today's video. Thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next one.